The mortars stop. That's when Private First Class Jack Harlan knows something is wrong. January 22nd, 1944. 43 men from the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment have been holding a farmhouse outside Anzio for 9 days. They've run out of ammunition, they've run out of food, they've run out of time. But when the German artillery falls silent at dawn, when the expected assault never comes, Harlan peers through a shattered window and sees something impossible. The enemy positions are empty, abandoned, as if the Wehrmacht simply vanished. This is the story of the platoon that held a ghost town. If this story interests you, consider subscribing. The Anzio beachhead was supposed to be a masterpiece. Operation Shingle, a surprise amphibian landing 30 miles behind German lines, designed to unhinge the entire Italian front and open the road to Rome. On January 22, 1944, 36,000 Allied troops came ashore virtually unopposed. By nightfall, they'd established a perimeter 15 miles deep. Then they stopped. Major General John Lucas, commanding the operation, made a decision that would define the next 4 months. Instead of exploiting the element of surprise and pushing inland, he ordered his forces to dig in and consolidate the beachhead. It was the cautious choice, the sensible choice. It was also the wrong choice. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, couldn't believe his luck. He'd been caught completely off guard by the landing, with only 2 battalions in the immediate area. But Lucas's hesitation gave him something infinitely more valuable than troops: time. Within 48 hours, Kesselring had 7 divisions racing toward Anzio from across Italy. Within a week, he had the beachhead surrounded. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a siege. The Allies found themselves trapped in a pocket, roughly 15 miles wide and 7 miles deep, a shallow bowl of farmland and marsh, rimmed by the Alban Hills, where German artillery observers had a perfect view of every square yard of Allied territory. There was no front line in the traditional sense. There was no rear area. There was only the beachhead, and everything in it was within range of German guns. The statistics told one story: over 7,000 Allied casualties in the first 3 weeks. But statistics couldn't capture what it felt like to live inside that killing jar, where death arrived randomly from the hills, where sleep was a luxury measured in minutes, where the distinction between combatant and casualty was often just a matter of luck. By February, the beachhead had become something worse than a battleground. It had become a graveyard that occasionally moved. Private First Class Jack Harlan had jumped into Normandy with the 82nd Airborne before being transferred to the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment for the Italian campaign. He was 23 years old, though his hands looked 40. The constant dampness did that, turned skin leathery, made fingers stiff and clumsy with the cold that seeped up from the marshy ground around Anzio. He'd volunteered for Airborne because it paid an extra $50 a month. Now, crouched in a farmhouse 3 miles beyond the relative safety of the main beachhead perimeter, he would have paid $50 just to be back there. The farmhouse, nobody knew its name, so they called it Objective Baker, sat astride a dirt road that ran northeast toward the town of Cisterna. It wasn't strategically vital. It wasn't particularly defensible. It was simply there, and some staff officer had decided it should be held, so 3rd Platoon, Dog Company, got the assignment. 43 men, 1 stone farmhouse, 1 barn, a scattering of outbuildings that had been bombed into rubble during the initial advance. Their orders were simple: hold the position for 72 hours while the main force consolidated. Then they'd be relieved. That was 9 days ago. Lieutenant Paul Mitchell commanded 3rd Platoon. He was a 26-year-old former school teacher from Ohio who'd been commissioned 18 months earlier. He had a habit of cleaning his glasses when he was thinking, which meant they were always clean. On the morning of day 9, Mitchell stood in what remained of the farmhouse kitchen, studying a map that was more coffee-stained than geography. "We're not getting relieved," he said to Sergeant Tom Wolcott. Wolcott, a 31-year-old coal miner from Pennsylvania who'd seen action in North Africa, just nodded. He'd known that since day 5. The situation was simple enough to understand, complicated enough to kill them. The Allied lines had contracted under German pressure. The bulge that 3rd Platoon had been sent to hold had become a salient, then a peninsula, then an island. Now they were 3 miles beyond the nearest friendly forces, surrounded by German positions on 3 sides, with only the road behind them as a tenuous thread back to the beachhead. That road was under constant observation from the hills. Anything that moved on it during daylight drew immediate artillery fire. The last supply run had been 4 days ago, a jeep that made it through with ammunition and water, but took a direct hit on the return trip. Since then, silence. Mitchell had tried the radio. Static. Tried again at the designated check-in times. More static. Either the radio was damaged, or someone had decided 3rd Platoon was no longer worth the risk of communication. In the barn, Corporal Eddie Russo was taking inventory. Russo was a 19-year-old from Brooklyn who'd lied about his age to enlist. He had a gift for scrounging, for making something from nothing, but even his talents had limits. Ammunition, 67 rounds for the Browning automatic rifle. Maybe 200 rifle rounds total, distributed among 43 men. 3 grenades, 2 boxes of machine gun ammo for the .30 caliber they'd salvaged from a destroyed position. But the gun's barrel was warped and it jammed every 5th round. Food, 11 K rations, some hardtack one of the guys had been saving. A can of peaches that Private Danny Kowalski kept in his pack like a religious relic. Water, what they could collect from the farm's well, which tasted of sulfur and whatever the Germans had dumped in it during their retreat. Medical supplies, 1 first aid kit, mostly used, bandages made from torn shirts, morphine syrettes they'd pulled from dead men during the first German probe on day 3. Russo wrote it all down in the small notebook he carried, then crossed out the numbers and wrote them again. The mathematics didn't improve. Outside, the landscape had changed. When 3rd Platoon first arrived, this had been farmland winter fields, bare but recognizable as places where things once grew. Now the earth was churned and pocked, every building damaged, every tree splintered into stark monuments of shattered wood. The only things that grew here were shell craters. The German positions were maybe 400 yards away to the north and east, close enough to hear voices during the quiet hours before dawn, close enough to smell their cigarettes when the wind shifted. 3rd Platoon had learned to tell time by the patterns of artillery fire, morning barrage at 700 hours, afternoon barrage at 1400 hours, random harassment fire throughout the night to prevent sleep. But the thing that worried Harlan most wasn't the artillery. It was the silence between the barrages. He'd been in enough fights to know what an attack felt like in its forming stages. The way enemy activity increased, the way patrols probed more aggressively, the way the shelling intensified before infantry moved in. None of that was happening. Instead, the German fire was almost perfunctory, as if they were going through the motions, as if they were waiting for something. On the night of day 8, Harlan pulled watch in the farmhouse's second-floor window, what remained of it. The glass was long gone, replaced by sandbags stacked to leave a narrow firing slit. He watched the darkness and tried to identify shapes in the shadows. Movement. Northeast corner, maybe 300 yards out. He brought his rifle up, finger on the trigger, breathing steady. Watched, waited. The shape moved again. Too quick for a man advancing. More like someone withdrawing. Harlan didn't fire. Ammunition was too precious to waste on shadows. But he watched that sector for the next 2 hours until Private First Class Robert Chen relieved him. Something's different out there, Harlan told him. Chen was a 20-year-old from San Francisco whose parents were in an internment camp back in California. He'd volunteered anyway. He had the sharpest eyes in the platoon and the patience of someone who'd learned early that life rarely moved at the speed you wanted. "I know," Chen said. "I've been feeling it too." Dawn on day 9 broke cold and clear. The kind of morning that would have been beautiful anywhere else, pale light spreading across the Alban Hills, touching the peaks with gold, painting long shadows across the valley. Harlan woke to silence. Not the relative quiet between artillery barrages, but actual silence. No rumble of distant guns, no crack of rifle fire from the main beachhead, no morning barrage at 700 hours. He sat up in the corner of the farmhouse where he'd been sleeping, calling it sleeping was generous. It was more like unconsciousness interrupted by shivering, and looked around. Other men were stirring, faces gaunt, eyes hollow. Private Kowalski had his can of peaches out, just looking at it. Private First Class Marcus Webb, a medic from Georgia, was rewrapping the bandage on his left hand, where shrapnel had torn away 2 fingers on day 4. Lieutenant Mitchell appeared from what had been the farmhouse's root cellar, where he'd set up his command post. His face was drawn, glasses slightly crooked. "Sergeant Wolcott," he called quietly. "Something's wrong." Wolcott was already at the window. He'd been at the window for the past hour. He didn't turn around when he spoke. "Sir, you need to see this." Mitchell crossed to the window. Harlan rose and followed, along with half a dozen other men. The German positions, the ones they'd been watching for 9 days, the machine gun nest in the ruined church 400 yards north, the mortar pit behind the stone wall to the northeast, the observation post in the bell tower of what had been a village chapel, were empty. Not abandoned in panic, equipment scattered. Empty in an organized way. The sandbags were still there, the defensive positions intact, but no movement. No smoke from cooking fires, no glint of sunlight off binoculars or rifle scopes. "Where did they go?" Mitchell asked. Wolcott shook his head slowly. "Don't know, sir. But they're gone." "It could be a trap," Corporal Russo said from behind them. "Pull back. Make us think they've withdrawn. Wait for us to move into the open." Chen appeared at the opposite window. "East side is clear too, sir. No activity at all." Mitchell cleaned his glasses, a gesture so familiar now that no one noticed. His mind was working through the possibilities, none of them good. If the Germans had withdrawn, it meant the situation at the main beachhead had changed. Maybe the Allies had broken out. Maybe reinforcements had landed. Maybe the siege was over, or it meant something worse. Harlan voiced what several of them were thinking. "Sir, what if they didn't withdraw? What if they repositioned? What if they're preparing for something bigger?" That was the nightmare scenario that the Germans had pulled back to make room for a major assault. That 3rd Platoon was about to find itself directly in the path of a regimental attack, or worse. Mitchell made a decision. We sit tight. We watch. If they're gone, they're gone. If it's a trap, we'll see it when they spring it. Either way, we can't move in daylight. That road behind us is still a kill zone. So, they watched. The morning passed. No artillery. No movement from the German positions. The silence was more unsettling than the shelling had been. At least with artillery, you knew where you stood. This was uncertainty, and uncertainty was corrosive. At 1100 hours, Mitchell tried the radio again. Still static. But this time, buried in the white noise, there might have been voices. Might have been. He couldn't be sure. Afternoon came. The sun tracked across the sky, indifferent to the 43 men waiting in the farmhouse. Harlan found himself staring at the empty German positions, trying to spot some sign of life, some indication that this wasn't as strange as it seemed. Private Kowalski finally opened his can of peaches, shared them around. 43 men, 13 peach slices. It wasn't much, but it was something. The sweetness was almost painful after days of hardtack and sulfur water. Sergeant Wolcott organized a head count, more for something to do than out of necessity. 43 men, same as yesterday. 21 effective combatants. 11 walking wounded who could still fight. 8 casualties who needed evacuation. 3 men with trench foot so bad they could barely stand. As the sun began its descent toward the hills, painting everything in shades of amber and rust, Lieutenant Mitchell called a council in the root cellar. Mitchell, Wolcott, Russo, Chen, Harlan, and Webb, the medic. The map was still coffee-stained. The situation was still impossible. But now there was a new variable: the empty German positions. "We have 3 options," Mitchell said. 1. We stay here and wait for relief that might never come. 2. We try to make it back to the main lines tonight, moving down that road in the dark with 8 men who can barely walk. 3. We move forward, verify that the Germans really have withdrawn, and see if we can establish what's happening. Nobody liked any of the options. Wolcott spoke first. "Sir, if we try to move the wounded down that road at night, we'll lose half of them. They can't keep up, and we can't carry them all. If we stay here and the Germans come back tomorrow with a real attack, we're finished. We don't have the ammunition to hold this position for another day. So we go forward," Russo said. It wasn't a question. Mitchell nodded slowly. "We send out a patrol. 4 men. Check the nearest German positions. If they're really abandoned, we'll know more about what we're dealing with. If it's a trap, hopefully 4 men can get back to warn the rest of us." Harlan knew what was coming next. "Lieutenant, I'll go." Chen nodded. "Me too." "Russo, I'm in." "Wolcott, I'll take the 4th slot, sir." Mitchell looked at each of them. His hands moved to his glasses, but stopped. "Thank you. You leave at 1800 hours, just before dark. Check the church first, then the mortar position. Stay together. At the first sign of enemy contact, you fall back. This is reconnaissance, not a raid. Understood?" "Understood, sir." 1800 hours came too quickly. The sun was a red wound on the western horizon, bleeding light across the valley. Harlan checked his rifle for the 10th time. 8 rounds. That's all he had. Chen carried the BAR with 43 rounds. They'd given him the best weapon because he was the best shot. Russo had his M1 carbine and 1 grenade. Wolcott carried a Thompson submachine gun with a 30-round magazine, half full, 4 men. Combined firepower that wouldn't last 60 seconds in a real firefight. Mitchell met them at the farmhouse door. His voice was quiet, meant only for them. "You don't have to do this." Wolcott's response was flat. "Yes, sir, we do," because staying was just dying slowly. Going forward was at least doing something. Even if that something was walking into a trap, at least it was movement. At least it was choice. They moved out into the twilight. The ground was a nightmare of mud and shell craters. Every step had to be tested. Weight shifted carefully to avoid the snap of a stick or the splash of water that would carry in the stillness. The air smelled of cordite and decay, the usual perfume of the beachhead, but concentrated here, where the fighting had been most intense. Harlan's heart hammered steadily, a rhythm that seemed too loud, too obvious. His breath came in shallow draws through his nose. Beside him, Chen moved like smoke, the BAR held ready but relaxed, finger outside the trigger guard until needed. The German church, it had been a church once, before artillery turned it into a sculpture of broken stone and exposed timber, was 300 yards from the farmhouse. The journey took 20 minutes. They approached from the south, using a shell crater for cover. Wolcott hand-signaled. Chen left, Russo right, Harlan with me. Center approach. They moved. The machine gun position was definitely abandoned. Sandbags still stacked in their defensive pattern. Empty ammunition boxes, cigarette butts, a discarded helmet with a bullet hole through the crown, but no soldiers, no equipment, no weapons. Harlan swept his rifle across the interior. Nothing. Just the debris of occupation and the echoes of men who were no longer there. Chen appeared from the left side, shaking his head. Clear. But look at this. He led them to what had been the church's sacristy. On the floor, arranged with deliberate care, were supplies. Boxes of ammunition, stacked neatly. Tins of food, unopened. Water cans, full. Medical supplies, and in the center, written in German on a piece of cardboard torn from a ration box, "Für die Amerikaner," for the Americans. Russo stared at it. What the hell? Wolcott picked up one of the ammunition boxes, American-made, 30-06, from their own supply dumps that the Germans must have captured during earlier fighting. They'd left it here. Left it for 3rd Platoon to find. This isn't a trap, Harlan said slowly. They're gone, really gone, and they left us supplies. But why? That question hung in the air like smoke. Why would an enemy who'd been shelling them for 9 days, who'd launched 3 separate probes against their position, who'd had them surrounded and isolated, suddenly withdraw and leave behind supplies? Wolcott made a decision. Chen, Russo, head back to the farmhouse. Get Lieutenant Mitchell and as many men as he can spare. We're securing this position and bringing back these supplies. Harlan, you're with me. We're checking the mortar pit. The mortar pit was 200 yards northeast, behind a low stone wall that ran along what had been a property boundary. They approached with even more caution than before, because if one position being abandoned was strange, 2 was a pattern that needed explanation. The mortars were gone, the actual tubes, the base plates, everything that could be carried, but the position itself was intact. And here too, the Germans had left something: more ammunition, more supplies, and another cardboard sign. This one was different. This one had a message written in careful English. The war is ending, go home to your families. Harlan felt something shift in his chest. Not relief, not exactly. Something more complicated. These weren't faceless enemies anymore. These were men who'd spent 9 days trying to kill 3rd Platoon, and now they were leaving messages about family. Wolcott was reading something else, a newspaper, German, dated 3 days ago. His German was rudimentary, learned from a grandfather who'd emigrated before the First World War, but he could make out the headlines. Soviet advance in the East, Allied bombing of German cities, strategic withdrawals in Italy, and buried in the middle pages, an article about the Italian campaign, about Anzio, about the impossibility of the situation. The Germans weren't withdrawing because they'd been beaten here. They were withdrawing because they were needed elsewhere. The whole Italian front was collapsing. Kesselring was pulling units north to establish new defensive lines. The Anzio beachhead, this killing jar that had trapped both sides for months, was suddenly irrelevant. 3rd Platoon hadn't been forgotten. They'd been obsoleted. The war had moved on without them. By the time full darkness fell, Lieutenant Mitchell had men bringing supplies back from both German positions. The haul was substantial enough to change everything: ammunition, food, water, medical supplies. Enough to keep 3rd Platoon alive for another week if they had to wait that long for relief. But more than the supplies, it was the evidence of withdrawal that mattered. As the men explored the abandoned German positions over the next hours, the pattern became clear. This hadn't been a panicked retreat. This had been an organized withdrawal by a professional military force that no longer saw any point in killing 43 surrounded American paratroopers. Private Webb, the medic, found something in the German aid station that nearly made him cry. Proper bandages, antiseptic, morphine. Real morphine, not the dregs they'd been rationing. He could finally treat the wounded properly. Private Kowalski found a crate of German rations and discovered that schnitzel in a can was surprisingly edible when you hadn't eaten real meat in 9 days. Chen found something else: a German helmet left hanging on a post with a note tucked inside. The note was in German, but Chen brought it to Wolcott to translate. The sergeant read it slowly, then read it again. His voice was quiet when he spoke. To the American soldiers, you fought well. The war is not over, but this battle is. We leave you these supplies because no one should die for a position that no longer matters. If we meet again, it will be as enemies. Until then, go home. Signed, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, 114th Jaeger Division. Mitchell stood in the farmhouse kitchen, the one place they'd managed to get a small fire going in the damaged stove, and listened as Wolcott repeated the translation. Around them, 43 men, exhausted, wounded, filthy, but alive, listened too. Someone laughed. It might have been Russo. The sound was strange after days of whispers and careful silence. The laugh became another laugh, and then someone else was laughing too, Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it all had finally exceeded their capacity to process it any other way. They'd been forgotten by their own side and spared by their enemy. They'd held a worthless farmhouse for 9 days against an enemy that had decided the farmhouse wasn't worth taking. They'd been preparing to die, and instead, they'd inherited abandoned German positions stocked with supplies. It was too strange to be believed, except it was happening. Mitchell raised his hand for quiet. Listen up. We're not out of this yet. We still have to get back to the main lines, and that road is still dangerous during daylight. But we now have supplies, we now know the German positions are empty, and we now have options we didn't have this morning. He paused, cleaned his glasses. One more thing. Captain Weber was right. This position doesn't matter anymore. The war moved on without us. But I want you all to remember this. For 9 days, you held this ground against everything the Wehrmacht threw at you. You held it with nothing, no supplies, no support, no hope of relief. You held it because you're paratroopers, and paratroopers don't quit. Wolcott spoke up. And because we're too stubborn to know when to die, sir. That got another laugh, smaller but genuine. That night, for the first time since 3rd Platoon had occupied the farmhouse, the men slept without the fear of immediate attack. Harlan took a watch shift and found himself staring at the German positions, now confirmed empty, and thinking about Hauptmann Weber and his men. Somewhere out there, those German soldiers were marching north, probably just as exhausted, just as glad to leave this particular piece of hell behind. They'd been enemies. They'd shot at each other for 9 days, but at the end, when it no longer mattered, they'd chosen mercy over vindictiveness. They'd left supplies instead of booby traps. It didn't make the war right. It didn't erase the 9 days of fear and hunger and watching friends die. But it meant something. Harlan wasn't sure what, exactly, but it meant something. At dawn on day 10, the radio crackled to life. Static, then a voice. Faint, but clear. 3rd Platoon, this is beachhead control. Do you read? Over. Mitchell grabbed the handset so fast he nearly dropped it. Beachhead control, this is 3rd Platoon. We read you. Over. 3rd Platoon, what is your status? Over. Mitchell looked around the farmhouse at 43 men who'd become something more than soldiers over the past 9 days. 43 effectives, limited ammunition, multiple wounded, but holding position and ready for extraction. Over. The voice on the radio paused, then came back stronger. Copy that, 3rd Platoon. Relief column moving to your position at 1400 hours. Hold tight, you've done well. Over. Mitchell hung the handset back on the radio and allowed himself the smallest smile. Sergeant Wolcott, he said. Prepare the platoon for extraction. Yes, sir. At 1400 hours exactly, the relief column appeared on the road behind them. 2 half-tracks, 3 trucks, and an escort of tanks. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, battalion commander, rode in the lead half-track. When he saw the condition of the farmhouse, the shell damage, the evidence of sustained fighting, his face went hard. He found Mitchell standing outside. 3rd Platoon assembled as well as they could manage 43 men who looked like scarecrows, uniforms torn and stained, faces gaunt, but standing at attention. Morrison stepped down from the half-track. Lieutenant Mitchell, report. Mitchell's voice was steady. Sir, 3rd Platoon occupied this position for 10 days as ordered. We held against 3 enemy probes, sustained multiple casualties, and maintained defensive integrity throughout. As of 0700 hours yesterday, German forces withdrew from surrounding positions. We secured their abandoned supplies and maintained observation until your arrival. Morrison walked the line of men, seeing the bandages, the 1,000-yard stares, the way some of them swayed on their feet from exhaustion. When he finished, he came back to Mitchell. You were ordered to hold for 72 hours. You held for 10 days with no supply, no support, and no communication. He paused. Why didn't you withdraw when you realized you were cut off? Mitchell didn't hesitate. Sir, we were given an order to hold this position. We held it. Morrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. Well done, Lieutenant. Get your men in the trucks. There's hot food and medical attention waiting at the beachhead. As 3rd Platoon loaded into the trucks, the wounded first, everyone helping, no man left to struggle alone, Harlan took one last look at the farmhouse. It was just a building. Just stone walls and a damaged roof, pocked by shellfire, marked by violence. But for 10 days, it had been their entire world, and they'd held it. Not because it was strategically important, not because it changed the outcome of the war, but because they'd been told to hold it, and they'd decided that meant something. Chen appeared beside him. "Ready to go?" Harlan nodded. "Yeah, more than ready." They climbed into the truck together. The convoy started moving, heading back down the road toward the beachhead. Behind them, the farmhouse stood empty, already beginning its transformation from recent history into memory, from lived experience into story. The mortars had stopped, but not because 3rd Platoon had been overrun. They'd stopped because sometimes, in the calculus of war, mercy made more sense than murder. They'd stopped because 43 men had held a position long enough for it to stop mattering, and in the end, that was its own kind of victory. 3rd Platoon reached the main beachhead at 1500 hours on February 2, 1944. They were immediately hospitalized, all 43 men, because even those who could walk were suffering from exhaustion, malnutrition, and exposure. Private First Class Jack Harlan spent 3 weeks recovering. He was back in action by March and survived the war, returning to Michigan where he became a machinist. He never spoke much about Anzio, but he kept a German helmet in his garage, the one Chen had found with Hauptmann Weber's note inside. Sergeant Tom Wolcott received a Bronze Star for his leadership during the siege. He survived Anzio, survived the rest of the Italian campaign, and returned to Pennsylvania. He went back to the coal mines for 30 years, which some might say was harder than the war. Lieutenant Paul Mitchell was promoted to captain and given a commendation. He stayed in the Army after the war, taught tactics at West Point, and retired as a colonel. In his office, he kept the coffee-stained map from the farmhouse root cellar. Corporal Eddie Russo made it home to Brooklyn, married his sweetheart, and opened a restaurant. When people asked about his war service, he'd smile and say he learned to make something from nothing, which was useful in both war and business. Private First Class Robert Chen served through the end of the Italian campaign. After the war, he helped get his parents released from the internment camp. He became a photographer, specializing in landscapes, wide-open spaces, uncluttered by violence. Of the 43 men who held that nameless farmhouse for 10 days, 39 survived the war. That number is higher than chance would suggest, and those who knew them said it was because they'd learned something in those 10 days about surviving the unsurvivable. As for Hauptmann Friedrich Weber of the 114th Jaeger Division, records show his unit withdrew north from Anzio in early February and was reassigned to defensive positions near Cassino. He survived the war and returned to Bavaria, where he became a school teacher. In his classroom, he kept a photograph of the Anzio beachhead, though no one knew why. The farmhouse objective Baker, though it was never called that by anyone who'd actually been there, was destroyed by artillery in March during the final Allied breakout from Anzio. The Allies reached Rome on June 4, 1944. By then the farmhouse was already dust, and the men who'd held it had moved on to other battles, other impossible situations. But for 10 days in January and February of 1944, 43 men held a position that didn't matter against an enemy that eventually chose mercy over murder. They held it with nothing, and in the end, that nothing became enough. The war remembers the big battles, the famous names, the turning points that changed history. It rarely remembers the small moments, the isolated positions, the victories that look like survival, and the defeats that look like living. But those moments matter too. They matter because someone lived them. Someone held the line when the line seemed pointless. Someone chose to keep fighting when surrender would have been easier. 3rd Platoon learned something in that farmhouse that can't be taught in training, that sometimes you hold not because it matters strategically, but because it matters personally. That sometimes the enemy is just another man who's tired of dying for meaningless ground. That sometimes at the end of everything, there's a grace that transcends the war itself. The mortars stopped, and in that silence, 43 men discovered they'd been fighting ghosts, and in a way, they'd become ghosts too. Ghosts who chose to remain human, even when humanity seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. That's the story of the Ghost Platoon of Anzio. Not the battle that changed the war, but the 10 days that changed 43 men. Not the position that mattered, but the stand that meant something anyway. The war moved on. The men moved on. But the farmhouse, in the brief time before it was destroyed, stood as a monument to the idea that even in war, even in the worst circumstances, even when everything points toward death, sometimes not always, but sometimes there's another choice. The Germans made that choice. They left supplies instead of traps. They wrote notes about families instead of firing a final barrage. They withdrew not in defeat but in the recognition that some fights aren't worth finishing. And 3rd Platoon, in their own way, made a choice too. They held because they'd been told to hold. They survived because they refused to stop surviving. They became ghosts in a ghost town, and when the war moved on without them, they moved on too. 43 men, 10 days, one farmhouse that no longer exists. But the story remains. It remains because mercy, even in war, is worth remembering. It remains because survival, even when it looks like nothing more than stubborn refusal to die, is still a victory. It remains because somewhere in the chaos and mathematics of industrial warfare, individual choice still matters. The mortars stopped, and in that stopping, something impossible happened. Something that shouldn't have happened in a war defined by attrition and brutality and the grinding mathematics of casualties and replacements. Humanity persisted. Not everywhere, not all the time, but here, in this one moment, at this one farmhouse, between these specific soldiers on both sides, humanity found a crack in the armor of total war and slipped through. That's worth remembering. That's worth telling. That's why, 80 years later, the Ghost Platoon of Anzio deserves to be more than a footnote, more than a statistic, more than 43 names in a casualty report. They deserve to be what they were, men who held the line, survived the impossible, and discovered that even enemies can choose mercy when the guns finally fall silent.